You know, this is a black and white, two-dimensional picture from the Oasis on beautiful Lake Travis in Austin, Texas. It's actually a limited experience of the beauty of this place. I mean, it's much better in color and in three dimensions. I mean, when you just see it, when you're standing there, it's gorgeous. I mean, mansions and hills and trees and lakes surrounding you. But you know, that three-dimensional experience is actually a limited experience of a fourth dimension, time. You know, I've actually had many great memories in this place, all the way back to when I came here in college. And over the years, my family's had many great days on the lake, and then we've come to this place and had dinner and music and dancing and laughter together. I mean, it's incredible. My daughter even got engaged in this place. Now stop and think about it. This flat, two-dimensional black and white picture is really just a representation of a much bigger fourth-dimensional experience of life. And now imagine this. What if all of our experience in four dimensions of life, all the wonder, all the love, all the beauty, is really just a flat black and white representation of a fifth, sixth, seventh dimensional life to come called heaven? You know, that's actually what the Bible has been teaching us all along. And I believe understanding it really changes how we live and love and serve and how we care for God's creation today. And you know, having studied this for 30 years, it led me to faith, but it also helped me want to grow in faith. And that's what I'm hoping for you. You know, I really hope as you stick with us over these 6 weeks that you'll start to see how to bring heaven to earth more and more. You know, it's funny because we plan to do this What's After Life citywide conversation with over 200 churches and many organizations. We started to plan it 2 years ago, and yet here we find ourselves right in the middle of COVID-19 while doing this. It's not a coincidence, because people need hope right now. And God knew that, I believe. And they don't just need the hope of heaven, they need hope of a bigger perspective of what is happening in our lives right now. Because I think that helps us understand this life. And that's what I think you'll gain if you'll stick with us through this series. God wants us to know that He's prepared a place for us. And it's more beautiful than you can ever imagine, but it's experienced in new dimensions of time and space. You know, I've interviewed doctors and professors and nurses, people who are very credible, who have nothing to gain by trying to make up wild stories, and yet when they clinically died and were resuscitated, listen to what they said about the life to come.
Things were more beautiful than I could ever imagine. It was past anything that I would believe that it would be like.
The colors were so alive that the most beautiful day on earth is just a reflection of those colors.
The greens were greener, the yellows, the golds, the blues, everything reminded me that earth is a reflection of heaven, but heaven is perfection.
So one of the commonalities of near-death experiences is they experience beauty in new dimensions of time and space. Flowers, trees, mountains, forests, in colors more vibrant than we can imagine. And they are not limited in their experience of beauty like we are here.
About 52% of people having a near-death experience describe beauty in this heavenly realm that is beyond anything on earth, things that are absolutely spectacular.
It seemed like everything there was glad I was there. The trees were glad I was there, the flowers were glad I was there, the water was glad I was there. Everything was alive, there was nothing dead, and everything was intelligent.
Everything was far more intense. The colors, the aromas, the flowers were such that I felt that I could not only see them, but I understood them.
Gorgeous, beautiful, all of the adjectives, but it's beyond words.
You know, as part of my research over the last 30 years, not only have I studied over 1,000 of these near-death experiences, NDEs, when people clinically die and come back, but I also compared what they said to the various religious writings and what they anticipated about the afterlife. So in my study of over 1,000 NDEs, they make about 40 common descriptions of the life to come. And then I took it and I compared it, these 40, to, for instance, the Buddhist Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Islamic scriptures, the Quran, which had a few correlations to them. The Hindu Vedas, some aspects of oneness that it talks about, several other things had correlations. The Zoroastrian Avesta actually had 5 out of the 40 correlate, but with all of them I found just as many or more discrepancies. But when I took a look at the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures, the Jewish Old Testament prophets and the New Testament, what it says about Jesus, I found a full 38 out of the 40 descriptions correlating. And I want to share that with you over the course of this series because I don't think God just has started to reveal himself today with modern medicine bringing people back from dead. He's been telling us all along. And I think the Bible actually gives us context to interpret these near-death experiences and understand what do they mean. So for instance, talking about beauty, John, one of Jesus' disciples, says he had an experience of heaven, a vision of heaven, and he writes about its beauty in the book of Revelation. Beauty not unlike earth. Take a look. He says, after this I looked, and people from every nation, tribe, people, and language were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. So they're palm trees in heaven. He says he will lead them to springs of life-giving water. They're springs, they're rivers. He took me in the spirit to a great high mountain. He showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, that shone with the glory of God. So they're high mountains, they're cities. And then the angel showed me a river with the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb. It flowed down the center of the main street. They're streets. On each side of the river grew a tree of life bearing 12 crops of fruit. They're trees, there's fruit. It's life. But as Jesus said, it's abundant life. It's life experienced in dimensions far beyond what we've ever experienced before. And you know, when I would read these things in the Bible that John said, honestly, some of them sounded kind of cheesy and gaudy to me. You know, streets of gold and pearl gates. And you know, I would picture a bad 80s televangelist TV set. But actually, the more and more I studied these near-death experiences from all around the world, I started to hear them describe the same things, and I started to realize this is otherworldly building materials, gold that is transparent. You know, blocks of stone that walls are made out of, but they're made of love and light, which makes no sense. Or this pearlescent material that is moving and alive. It's like if we were trying to describe our four-dimensional experience of color in a flat black and white terms. You know, in flat black and white terms. Impossible. Now, I know some people will still be skeptical, even hearing doctors and nurses and professors talking about this invisible place called heaven. And I get it, but here's something that I find interesting. You know, as a former engineer, a science-minded person, you know, I find ironically many times the idea of heaven is rebuffed in the name of science. And yet if you really look at where science is going, for instance, the Kaluza-Klein theory, a unified field theory, postulates that there has to be a fifth dimension for science to work as we understand it now. Brian Greene, in his book, The Elegant Universe, talks about how quantum mechanics works perfectly, general relativity works perfectly, but they don't work together unless there are 6 or 7 hidden dimensions to space. So if science is telling us that there are probably hidden dimensions, why is it so hard to think about heaven, this place beyond our dimensional understanding? Okay, so where's the proof though, you might be asking? Well, interestingly, what I found is when people die, they say they leave their bodies, but they still have a body, a spiritual body, but it's real. And then they travel often to this place of great beauty. But before they do, many times they say they are right there in the room, up above, usually up by the ceiling, watching their resuscitation. And they're able to make observations that can later be verified. Do you know that 900 scholarly articles by once skeptical doctors or professors have been written on these experiences in journals like Psychiatry or The Lancet, Europe's most prestigious medical journal? Cases like the woman in London that Dr. Jeff Long reports are talked about, like where she died giving birth, and she claimed that she left her body and was up on the top of the ceiling watching the resuscitation, and she noticed a red sticker on the top side of the ceiling fan, the ceiling side. And then she travels to this place of great beauty where God tells her, your son is going to live. She didn't even know it was a boy, and you must go back and take care of him. And when she comes back and resuscitates, she tries to tell the doctors and nurses of this incredible place she went, more real than anything she's experienced, and they didn't believe her. They said, oh, it's drugs, it's hallucination. But she kept on with this one nurse until she convinced the nurse to go, and the nurse got an orderly who got a ladder, and she said, go up and look on the top side of the fan and see if there isn't a red sticker up there. And sure enough, there was. Now, many observations like this have been made. And you may say, well, yeah, but how do you know these aren't just urban myth? Well, I talked to Dr. Michael Sabom, a once skeptical doctor, who actually set out to prove these were myth. And after 5 years of research, because of what people reported about resuscitation, he was a cardiologist, and they saw him resuscitating, and what they reported, he changed his mind. And he wrote an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in JAMA. And Dr. Janice Holden, a university professor, actually took these observations and did a study of near-death experiencers making verifiable observations. She studied 93 patients who had clinically died and claimed they were in the room, out of their bodies, making observations. Each one could make many observations. What she found is that 93% of the observations were completely accurate. 6% had slight discrepancies. Only one of the 93 patients she interviewed was really inaccurate. Radiation oncologist Dr. Jeff Long was a skeptic when he actually read Dr. Michael Sabom's JAMA article, and he started studying it for himself and has now done the largest scientific study on NDEs in 31 languages around the world. Listen to what he says to skeptics.
Some skeptics think it's impossible to study something that isn't a physical phenomena that you can visibly see and measure. However, I can assure people with those concerns that science broadly embraces subjective phenomena, and that's the entire fields, for example, of psychiatry, etc., subjective, qualitative, if you will, research. So it's very well established scientifically, very well validated, and very well accepted. A basic scientific principle is that what is real is consistently observed, and the overwhelming consistency of what's observed in near-death experiences strongly bespeaks their reality. The way I study near-death experiences, again with the best scientific methodology that seems to be published, is through a very, very detailed survey. There's over 100 questions that I ask. So in my over 4,000 near-death experiences I've studied, I'm not only getting a large number of near-death experiences, but we can look at them in a depth that was never possible before. Some people have wondered if near-death experiences are due to drugs or anesthetic agents. In having studied over 4,000 near-death experiences, the great majority of these people that had them were not taking any psychotropic, that is, brain-acting medication at the time of the experience. So there's no chance that drugs could account for what's observed in near-death experiences. Some skeptics have proposed that near-death experiences are due to hypoxia, which is low blood oxygen levels. Well, that's a reasonable hypothesis because, after all, at the time of a life-threatening event, typically you are going to have reduced oxygen levels in the blood as a result of the trauma or injury that led to that close brush with death. In any other altered type of human consciousness, dreams, hallucinations, psychotic events, You typically have confused sensorium. Experiences may skip around in dreams that are very common. You really have that hypo or decreased lucidity, and that's completely different in near-death experiences, which are hyper or increased lucid, tends to be very logically and ordered. I can't find a single skeptical explanation of near-death experience that any reasonable, well-informed person would accept as explaining near-death experience. One of the strongest lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience is they shouldn't happen at all. At the time of a cardiac arrest, when your heart stops, well, of course, immediately, blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after that event, the EEG, electroencephalogram, which is a measure of brain electrical activity, goes absolutely flat. It should be impossible to have a lucid, organized experience at that time, and yet by the hundreds, people have reported near-death experiences immediately following a cardiac arrest, and that is medically inexplicable.
So science is validating what the Bible's been teaching us all along. There is a life to come and a place of more beauty than we've ever imagined. And people say that they had a new body, a spiritual body, but with new abilities. Now it's interesting, I think Paul in the New Testament actually writes about this. You know, Paul was actually a Pharisee, one of the Pharisees that had Jesus crucified. And Paul did not believe in Jesus, and yet on the Damascus Road, he experiences this brilliant, blinding God of light, like near-death experiencers experience, and came to realize he was Jesus. Paul goes on to write much of the New Testament, but I believe later Paul actually had a near-death experience. It's recorded in Acts chapter 14. He's in the town of Lystra, a Greek city. A mob turns on him, stones him to death. And it says this: they stoned Paul and dragged him out of town thinking he was dead. But as the believers gathered around him, he got back up and went back into the town, which I think is just crazy. I mean, I just picture Paul like, he gets up and runs back in the town. What do you say? Like, I double dog dare you, stone me to death again. But seriously, I think this is when he had a near-death experience, because he later writes about that. In 2 Corinthians 12, he says, I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows, because he still had a body. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise, and I heard things so astounding they cannot be expressed in words. Things no human is allowed to tell. Now, several fascinating correlations here. First, Paul felt like he was himself. He had a body. He didn't know if he was in his body or out of his body, because we're still ourselves. And then he sees things that he says words can't express, beyond our dimensional reality. And he hears things that he says no one is allowed to tell. Now that's fascinating, because many near-death experiencers say on the other side they were given knowledge, like all their questions were answered. They felt like they fully understood all the questions of earth. And yet when they came back, they would say, I knew I understood it there, but it's like I wasn't allowed to tell it here, which is exactly what Paul says. And Paul also writes in 1 Corinthians 13, for now we see only a reflection, but then we will see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I'm fully known. Now imagine that day. You know, imagine the day when you're fully yourself. And that's what many indie ears said to me. You've never been so fully yourself as that day when you come fully alive, fully known, fully accepted. You fully fit your home. And your home in a new body. No longer any disabilities, no more aches or pains, and new powers, new abilities. So that you can go and experience and explore all of God's beauty, all of creation. And actually, I believe that's what Paul explains as well in 1 Corinthians 15:33. He says, our bodies are buried in brokenness, but they'll be raised in glory. They're buried in weakness, but they'll be raised in, the word in Greek is dunamos, in power, in strength. They're buried natural human bodies, but they'll be raised as spiritual bodies. And Paul tells us exactly what indie ears say around the globe. They were fully themselves. They had a spiritual body, arms, legs, feet. We could understand and remember each other and recognize each other and hug and kiss. But we weren't limited in our abilities. Not just 5 senses, it's more like 50 senses. In some cases, they described it as blended senses. Because our bodies are raised, as the Bible says, in power. And in fact, you even see examples of this. For instance, John in the book of Revelation says, an angel took me in the spirit to a great high mountain. He showed me the holy city, Jerusalem. The wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were written the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Okay, how could John be up on a great high mountain and yet read the names written on the foundation stones probably miles away? Unless, just like Paul said, our bodies are raised in new powers of sight and smell. And listen to how indie ears I interviewed talk about it.
I was in this experience for what felt to me like many, many, many hours. But in fact, the entire thing was probably 30 minutes.
My eyes were obviously completely enhanced, completely strengthened.
It seemed like all my senses took on the other attributes of the senses. So even though I could hear it, it seemed like I could also see it with my hearing.
People talk about how their experience on the other side is more lucid, more aware, more conscious, not just 5 senses. Some describe it as having 50 senses. It's fully alive like we've never imagined.
It's as though somebody put a film over what we see here, and then a film was removed, and all of a sudden the brilliance is exposed.
In my survey, 74.4% reported heightened senses. They were actually able to see much more clearly than in earthly life. Even people with severely impaired vision or blindness were able to see with perfect vision in their near-death experience.
I could see something infinitely far away as if it was right in front of me. I could see the trees and the flowers, and I could see every detail. I could see every individual blade of grass.
In heaven, we can hear it all, take in it all, just like we can all the sights of heaven, the aromas of heaven, which are sweet and overwhelming. It's a buffet for the senses. It's a sensory explosion.
And imagine the fun of exploring all of God's creation, all of beauty with all these new senses, and imagine all the time in the world to enjoy it. Did you notice Dr. Mary Neal said, it felt like hours and hours and hours, but she was clinically dead for 30 minutes. And that, interestingly, that's what Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, actually says in 2 Peter 3:8. A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day. And that's exactly what indie ears say. They say things like time worked differently over there. Some would say there was no time. Or some would say, well, there was time, but it wasn't the same because you were never in a hurry. You always had plenty of time. And another bizarre thing they sometimes say is there was no distance, or distance wasn't the same. Because travel could be instantaneous with a thought. Just think, if you can think and be there, what's distance? But they also said you could also travel slowly, like by floating along or flying along, which I know, it sounds crazy, bizarre, right? I mean, I was an engineer. Science, logic, reason. This stuff sounds crazy to me, that's why it took me 30 years to write about it. But when you hear thousands of people across the globe in many languages saying the same thing, you got to ask yourself, what's the evidence pointing to? How else do you explain it? And especially when the Bible has taught it all along. Interestingly, Jesus was crucified that first Easter, but 500 eyewitnesses claimed he was risen from the dead and appeared to them. And one of the disciples, Thomas, the first couple of times didn't see him and didn't believe it. And he said, I'm not going to believe it until I stick my hand in Jesus' wound. Look what happened. John chapter 20, it says that evening the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly Jesus is standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger in here. Look at my hands. Put your hand in the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. See, Jesus was solid, physical. They could touch him, hug him. He could eat fish with them. And yet he could instantaneously just appear in a room behind locked doors. He could come and go. And yet they also report that he could float or fly away out of their vision. Acts 1:9 says after these resurrection experiences, after one of them, Jesus was taken up into a cloud while they were watching, and they could see him no longer. He floats up and away. Again, I know, sounds crazy, but the Bible's told us this, and indie ears around the globe are verifying it. And God's told us this because he wants us to have hope. Hope for a life to come that makes all our FOMO, our fear of missing out, fade away. Because think about that. I mean, doesn't that happen to you? It happens to me. You know, where you start to feel like, oh man, I don't have enough time in this life. I'm going to miss out. You know, or you're afraid you haven't done all that you want to do in life. Or even better, you get tempted to go away from God because you believe that somehow you're going to miss something good if you follow God. It's a lie. See, there is nothing in this flat black and white world that you're going to miss out on when you experience the life God created you to live. So follow him and trust him. Let go of that FOMO, of that fear of missing out. You know, as I was writing the chapter on beauty in the book Imagine Heaven, I was actually at a conference in the Sierras, sitting in this lush valley of steep mountains on either side, and I was sitting there thinking, I wish my son were here because we would go explore these mountains. And, you know, exploring nature is like I feel like God enjoys me enjoying it. And then I had this other thought, because my father-in-law had just passed away, and he was a scientist with NASA. In fact, he was the head of the space station project. He loved space. And all of a sudden I started to think, what if in heaven my whole family gathered together gets to explore the universe, to explore space? In fact, maybe that's why space is so vast, because it's just one of many playgrounds. Then when when travel is instantaneous, we can explore for eternity. That seems crazy to think about until you listen to some near-death experiencers. You know, one of the ones I interviewed was a commercial airline pilot, Captain Dale Black, who had an airline crash. His plane crashed, everyone died, but he came back to talk about flying in to the holy city of God. And then Heidi, who I'm actually going to interview her tonight at 7:30. So come back for that extended interview with Heidi, and I'll try to answer your questions. But she actually grew up in a Jewish atheist home where she was taught that Jesus is an absolute hoax, there is no God, but she always believed in God and prayed to God. And at 16, when her horse falls on her, she discovers Jesus and God are one. And listen to how he takes her hand, and listen to how they travel.
He took my hand and we flew. It was like we had this wave of light under our feet. It was pushing us forward, and he was grinning from ear to ear.
This incredible airborne view, a descending, slowing down airborne view of the city of gold. And it's a city that's walled. Over the city were majestic mountains that were as gorgeous as any that could be ever seen. However, they did not look that different than Earth. I noticed snow, so think about that. Snow, what does that mean? Atmosphere, temperature, snow, what's that all about? I noticed flying birds later. What does that mean? These are the kind of questions I ask.
Yeah.
Okay, if a bird is to fly, it can't be a vacuum. I'm floating is what I would call it. I could see the townships, as I called them, homes that people lived in, homes that were likely to be created for the people of heaven. Interestingly enough, they struck me by not so much the size as the architecture. I know nothing about architecture at all. I still don't. But I recognized that there was something divine about the architecture of the buildings. There were small, what we would call like condos here. There were single family residences that we would call here. There were huge palaces, and I could see that, but
and this is all inside the wall?
On the other side of the
around?
wall. I saw none of this.
And how big is this city? I mean, can you tell?
I could not tell, other than it was beyond the horizon both directions. There's countryside inside, so that it's gorgeous, beautiful, all of the adjectives times 1,000.
And see, God gave us all the promises of this life to come so that we wouldn't fear missing out in this life, so that we would love and follow and trust God, because this life is just a test. It's just a test preparing us for the real life to come. You know, one of the most compelling threads of evidence to me is what blind people say when they have their near-death experience. I report 3 of them in Imagine Heaven. One of them was an 8-year-old kid, Brad. But listen to what these blind people say, not only about the beauty of heaven, but about the light of heaven. So Brad said, I was walking up this field, immense field. It seemed I was so exhilarated, so unbelievably renewed, I wanted to stay forever. He said the weather was absolutely perfect, which a blind person would notice most. There was tremendous light up there. It seemed to come from every direction. It was all around. It seemed like everything, even the grass I had been stepping on, seemed to soak in that light. And then Vicky, another blind person, describes the light. And she says the light was something you could feel as well as see. And everybody there was made of light. Now, interestingly, Jesus says that. He says the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. Daniel, the Old Testament prophet, says a similar thing. Vicky goes on to say what the light conveyed was love. It was light and love together. She said it was like love came out of the grass. Love and light came out of the birds. Love came from the trees. It was incredible, really beautiful. Now think about this. How did these blind people come to describe light, the light of heaven, as shining out of everything with love, when they would have heard on earth light shines on things? And yet they're describing exactly what the Jewish prophet Isaiah wrote in 780 BC when he said, you will know that God's telling him this, you'll know that at last that I, the Lord, am your Savior. Remember, this is Jewish, Old Testament. No longer will you need the sun to shine by day or the moon to live by night, for the Lord your God will be your everlasting light in heaven, and your God will be your glory. And John sees the same thing in Revelation. It says the city has no need of sun or moon, for the glory of God illuminates the city, and the Lamb, Jesus, is its light, and the nations will walk in that light. How do these blind people, how do people around the world come to describe the same thing, except the light of heaven is the glory of God that lights up everything? And think about it. You heard how many people talk about the colors of heaven. Well, think about it. The colors of earth are a breakdown of the light spectrum of the sun. But imagine the spectrum of color if the light is the light of God. That's why they see colors far beyond anything we could imagine. Well, what do we do with all this knowledge? You know, Jesus taught us to pray, our Father in heaven, holy or hallowed, holy is your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. See, we learn about heaven that we, while we're here, might bring more of heaven to earth. And let me give you some practical ways to actually do that. First, trust God's goodness. You know, think about it. All of earth's beauty reveals God's glory as well. But earth is just a shadow of the glory of God. And so when you see the beauty of earth, when you see all the good gifts of earth, realize they're all just a tiny part of the goodness of God. And so when you get tempted to turn away from trusting God because somehow you're going to miss out on something good, that's a lie. Turn back to God and just ask him, God, you know, how can I trust you more? How can I follow you more? And then second, care for creation. You know, in Genesis chapter 1, God tells us that he gave us stewardship or watch over the earth. And learning about heaven shouldn't make us want to trash the earth. Instead, it should make us want to take seriously caring for God's creation. So just ask God, what can I do to better care for your creation to bring more of heaven to earth? And then 3, give grace more, because life on earth is hard. You know, Paul talked about this in Romans 8. He said, yet what we suffer now on earth is nothing compared to the glory God will reveal to us later. For all creation, the whole earth is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who his children really are. All creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Earth is birthing eternal children, but it's painful. And many of you right now, you're going through all kinds of different suffering. Many of us have lost our jobs. We're trying to hold on maybe to our companies. Maybe we're going through the stresses and strains of uncertainty. Maybe there are tensions in your relationships with your spouse or, your children or, people you're shut up with. And now is a great time to ask God, God, give me your grace and patience that I might give it to others. Because that's how God treats us. And then finally, create beauty. Every night at 6 p.m. in downtown Austin, in fact, in many cities around the country, people are shouting and celebrating our medical professionals, our doctors and nurses and medical employees who are working to save lives during COVID-19. That someone thought up as an act of beauty, to bless others. And you can do a similar thing. You've been given gifts by God. And so ask God, God, in this season, how can I bring beauty that blesses others? We can do that. And finally, a practical way is during this season, get connected to other people here at Gateway so that we grow together through this. As we said, we've created this kind of like Netflix little documentary series like what we've done together, but with a way that you can get together with groups of 10 or so and discuss it online. And you can just go to gatewaychurch.com, and we want to help you grow. If you're new, go click on Get Connected, gatewaychurch.com. Tell us you're new, tell us your address. We'll send you a free copy of Imagine Heaven so that you can start to grow that way. But also go click on Get in a What's After Life online group. No prerequisites, just come as you are. You don't have to know anything, but it's a great way to give support and get support and learn more in this season. Next week, we're going to talk about the God of light and love. You don't want to miss it. And this God of light and love told Moses to bless people with this blessing that I'd like to close with song, singing. The blessing comes from Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace.